Well, here we are in the third week, as I said, of the great season of Easter, and the third week also of what we're calling our Easter message series. And this series has a name. The name of this series is Love Lives, and it's a very fitting title in relationship to this great season of the resurrection. Because on Easter Sunday, as we reflected on the experience of the early Christians, of the apostles and the disciples, of Jesus' resurrection, and the stories about Jesus in the Gospels, one of the things that we discovered was that Jesus was love in action. And indeed, whenever we meet Jesus in the Gospel, not just at the time of the resurrection, whenever we meet Jesus in the Gospels, moving among the people, teaching, preaching, healing, whenever we meet Jesus, we see love in action. Now, that love was experienced in different ways. Sometimes the love of Christ was experienced as kind, gentle, encouraging. Sometimes his love was experienced as something challenging, and indeed it was, challenging and even fierce. But every time you see or encounter Jesus in the Gospels, you see love in action. Of course, as we all know, loving others, as Jesus did, does not always guarantee a loving response. You can do good and people may not like you for it. You can do good and people will criticize you for doing good. You can do good and people might even hate you. This is what happened, after all, to Jesus. Jesus acted with perfect love. And what was the result? His enemies put him to death. It looked like love had failed, because love died that day on the cross. It looked like love lost. But then something happened, something that no one expected. We expected. Every Easter we look forward to it. Every Lent we look forward to it on Easter Sunday, but they certainly didn't expect it. Nothing, no one saw it coming. Jesus didn't stay dead. Jesus conquered death. On Easter Sunday, he emerged from the grave victorious over sin and death, but also over darkness, hatred, jealousy, and violence. Now, on Good Friday, all of these things seem to have won a great victory. But 3 days later, on Easter Sunday, Jesus came out of the tomb. He who is love in action could not be defeated. And Easter, the celebration of Easter Sunday, and the entire season of Easter, which we're now in, Easter is the celebration, we could say even the proclamation or the teaching, that love lives. God is love, and God lives. This season is also the celebration that love and light are greater than death and darkness. However much we sometimes feel the opposite might be true, it's not. This season also is a celebration that the same power that gave Jesus the ability to be love in action, the ability to love others, that same power, that same grace, that same gift is available to us. Because through a relationship with Christ, through an encounter with him, we can tap into the power to love the people around us the way we really want to love them. Of our good intentions, there is no doubt. We talked the very first week about how I knew that all of us want to love those around us and in our lives, and that in practice we do so at best imperfectly. But Easter is a celebration that we can find the power that we need to love as we desire. And that's a great and wonderful discovery, because all of us, if we've lived a certain length of time on this earth and done our best to follow the Lord, have already experienced that our efforts to love based purely on our own human powers, on our own will and our own good intentions, so often disappoint. But loving others, loving those around us, loving those in our lives, through the power that comes from the love of God present in us, given to us as a great blessing and gift in our baptism, well, that is a very different approach, and that's what we need to do. And this season of Easter says that we can do that we can access that great gift that God has given us and continues to give us. And that is what this series is all about. Now, last week we looked at kind of a precursor to love. We looked at something that will really help us and enable us to love in the way we desire and in the way God desires us and created us to love. And we talked about looking at people the same way that God looked at them. So as we see others, to see them as God sees them, to see them as beloved sons and daughters, and to realize that, to hold that in our hearts in our relationships with others. The truth is that everyone has value because our Father in heaven sees them as his children. So the first key to loving those around us in the way we desire is to see them as God sees them. Now today, we're going to look at what love looks like, love in action, when you experience a rift, a separation in a relationship that should be a relationship of love. Now, relational rifts, these separations, these disagreements, call them what you will, run a wide gamut because they're so much, sadly, a part of our broken human life. They range from simple misunderstandings to disagreements and divisions to feuds and fights. Sometimes these can happen even in the most intimate of connections, in the family connection itself. Misunderstandings are commonplace. We kind of understand them a little bit anyway. In any personal or business relationship, it's going to happen. There will be breakdowns in communications, I guess you could say, is perhaps the cause of misunderstandings, a breakdown in communications. Indeed, there's a kind of a joke making the rounds that says that one of the biggest problems in communications is to labor under the illusion that communication has actually happened, because it doesn't always. So misunderstandings can be one cause of a rift. Some rifts, some separations in relationships come from disagreements or divisions. We just do not see an issue, a situation, in the same way that others see. Traditionally, politics is one of those. Right now, in this country and others, the proper way of approaching the pandemic. Some people see it one way, some people see it another way. Disagreement or division can be the cause of a rift in relationships. And then there are feuds and fights that are the result of our human brokenness. They're the result, perhaps, of disappointment of one party or the other, broken promises, thoughtless remarks, needless drama or overreaction in a particular situation, gossip, lies, unpleasantness, unkindness, things that are all too familiar to us from the life that we live. Now, in any relationship, as we've already started to set out, there are so many different ways that these rifts, that these separations can come about. The truth is, whether they begin small or whether they are already quite substantial, if they are never addressed, these rifts can become and will become deep divides separating us from one another, and exactly the opposite way that our Lord desires us to live in communion with one another. So, a question we would ask ourselves is, what does love look like in those situations? What is love in action in those situations where there is a rift in a relationship? And so to help us reflect on that, we're going to go back to today's gospel to an encounter that takes place on Easter Sunday, the evening of Easter Sunday. Peter and John, as you will recall, and the other apostles have gathered together. And one of the things they're trying to do, and it's even recorded in the Gospels, is to try and make sense of what's going on, of what's happening. Something is happening, they know, but they're not sure what. They would at that moment, no doubt, have had within them layers of emotions and feelings. After all, they've been through something astonishing and fearful. The religious and political authorities had killed Jesus just 3 days earlier. So they had a plan and a vision for their life with Jesus, and that plan and that vision was gone. So they were dealing, no doubt, with disappointment. They were also dealing, and the scriptures record this as well, they're also dealing with fear. Fear that the same leaders who killed Jesus might come after them because they were associated with Jesus. And on top of that is confusion. What is going on? The tomb is empty. The body of Jesus is missing. People are saying they've seen him alive. And over and above all these emotions, or perhaps we might even say underlying them all, they were also likely feeling a certain sense of shame because they had abandoned Jesus in his hour of need. And so they, as they gather, are in this whole muddled mess of emotion, and then Jesus appears. And what are the first words he says to them? To those who had abandoned him in his time of need? Well, Luke tells us. He He stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." There was a rift in their relationship, and Jesus shows us what love does, what love in action looks like. He offers peace. He extends the olive branch to them, and then he reassures them. Why are you frightened? And why do questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. Touch me and see. For a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. The apostles didn't believe their eyes. Who would? They just assume that this is some sort of ghost or apparition or an illusion. And so Jesus invites them to touch him, to see that he is for real. But even this doesn't completely, 100% convince them. Luke tells us. While they were disbelieving and still wondering, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish. He took it and ate it in their presence. A ghost or an illusion does not eat. Jesus does this to show them that he is really bodily present. But also, to come back to our theme, to break down the barriers between them. Luke continues. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. He opened their minds to help them see what had happened from God's perspective. Remember, we said that one of the first precursors to loving as we desire is to be able to see things from God's perspective, and that's exactly what Jesus is doing. He's going over the scriptures and showing them all those scriptures, all those words inspired by God. They're God's message to his people. And so he helps them to see him as God sees him, as the Father sees him, as the Father sent him from God's perspective. Because his crucifixion, his death, and resurrection was not a surprise to him or to his Father. It had been part of the plan all along. And so he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Christ is to suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." God had sent Jesus into the world for our sake, to suffer, to die, and to be raised from the dead, to reestablish a relationship with a broken world, to repair a rift in that relationship, a relationship that he refused to give up on. So Jesus is not only making peace with the apostles by appearing to them, he makes peace by giving them a job to do. You are witnesses, he says. You are witnesses. It's a pretty big job. He entrusts them with a huge responsibility, even though they had abandoned him. They just let him down. So looking at what Jesus does, we can learn that love lives in us when we are the first person to bring peace to a rift in one of our relationships. As Christ followers, it's a very descriptive term, but it's an accurate term for what it means to be Christian. We follow Jesus Christ. As Christ followers, we can extend peace to others for a very important reason. And it was told to us in this story we just heard from the gospel. Because we know that we have peace with God. How and why? Through what Jesus did. Through him. I know, as a Christ follower, that God is not holding my sins against me. I know he's not keeping score of all my past mistakes, unlike what other people might do or unlike what I might do in my worst moments. God's not doing that. Rather, he did everything he could to reestablish his relationship with me. And if I'm following Jesus Christ, can I do anything less? This is what we're called to. So I'm going to make 3 suggestions for doing this, to bringing peace to a relational rift, wherever it happens, whether it's at home, at work, at school, or with friends, even extended family sometimes. 3 suggestions. First, pray. Now, if you're in the midst or at the very beginning of one of these relational rifts, you might think, oh yeah, I'll pray. I'll pray that these people see what jerks they are and come crawling back to me asking me to forgive them, because that's the only correct and true way this can be solved. That, by the way, is not what I mean. We need to pray in such a way that we are reminded of the peace that we have and how we achieve this peace with God. We didn't achieve it by our own willpower. We didn't achieve it by putting ourselves forward or raising ourselves up above others. We received it because of the cross of Jesus Christ. And we are at peace as Christians. We can trust and believe that we are at peace with God. And our prayer needs to remind us of the source of that peace, how we came to that peace, so that we can then share it with others. And prayer helps us do that. Prayer helps me to develop the right attitude in desiring peace. And right attitude precedes right action. When I am overwhelmed with bitterness or my disappointment and frustration in a particular situation lead to inaction when it comes to bringing peace to the situation, prayer can be the way forward. It can help us do things we didn't think we can do. To achieve peace, I've got to get over that desire of always being right or always having the last word or winning every argument and seeing anything else as a failure. I have to get over that. I have to redefine success and what winning looks like in my relationships and in my life. Instead of being only all about winning, it needs to be about reestablishing relationship and restoring peace. What do I value? Winning or relationship and peace? So, prayer, first step. A second suggestion, make peace as quickly as possible. Think about our gospel story. Jesus went to the apostles the very night he rose from the dead. He didn't wait. This is so much easier for you and I to talk about than to do. Because on the surface, based on our purely human emotions, it seems like a waste of time. When the emotions are still raw from the separation, from the rift, from the division, from the argument, whatever it might be, you might be thinking, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to change this. The best thing to do is simply to let them sort themselves out, give it a little bit of time, they'll get over it, they'll come back, they'll understand. Just go on with life. But that, in truth, as many of us know from experience, is rarely true. That is rarely the case. A few minutes at the right moment, which is soon, goes a long way to bringing peace. So make peace as quickly as possible. That's a challenge for us, but by God's grace we can do it. Third, do something simple, very simple, as a sign of peace. Every week here at Mass, we offer one another the sign of peace. Well, we need to do that in our relationships, and especially when we have a relational rift, when there's a separation, a disagreement. Now, easy to say again, challenging to do, because the spiritual life is simple. It's not complicated, but it's not easy. But what we need to do is to extend that olive branch, that sign of peace, in a very simple way. And you might be able to guess what it is. All of us were taught this, to lapse into the language of another day, at our mother's knee. Many of us taught our children the same thing. What do? We say, I'm sorry. And really, most of the time, obviously every situation has its different aspects, but in most cases we can really do that. We can say I'm sorry with honesty, because if we're completely honest, we must acknowledge that in this disagreement, in this division, in this separation, in this rift, we own at least part of the problem. And we can certainly be sorry, at least for that part. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. I'm sorry I didn't understand you. I'm sorry I overreacted. I'm sorry this ever happened. I'd guess that 80 or 90% of our relational rifts can be solved with a simple I'm sorry, and really and truly owning our contribution to what has happened. Those words, and I hope some of you have been so blessed to experience this, those words, spoken humbly and vulnerably, tend to lower other people's defenses and to build bridges that reestablish relationships. God's love seeks to make peace. Now, St. Paul was a great Christian leader, he was a great evangelist, but he was also a great teacher of the Catholic Christian faith. And so he wrote to one of the early Christian communities in Rome, to be precise, about this importance of peace. And he said this: "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Live at peace with everyone. What if each one of us here today, and all of us watching online, what if we all resolved to do this? Well, it would transform us, it would transform our families and our community, but first of all, it would transform our own hearts. And we can do it. And we know we can do it. We can love others enough to offer them peace, to make that first move. And we can do it because we know that the same Jesus who died so that we could have peace with God lives in us to help us understand, and, to go back to last week, to see others as he sees them. Because to love as God loves, you've got to see as he sees.